come I greet your name. You answered me with love, not faith. 숨겨진 길에도 주의 손길심에 not me.
Give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over. Luke 6, verse 38. Long before power, headlines, and billion-dollar deals, there was a simple act of mercy. A church with little gave anyway. A family in need received more than money. They received a future, and years later, when pride, greed, and history collided, that buried seed of kindness rose again. Because God keeps better records than men do. The glass walls of the Shard Seoul Tower didn't just overlook the Han River. They seemed to hold the entire city in a state of quiet submission. Inside the penthouse office, Park Jae-won stood with his back to a mahogany desk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. At 60, his frame was lean, honed by a lifetime of expensive discipline and a diet of cold ambition. His hair, a distinguished salt and pepper, was swept back with surgical precision. He didn't look like a man who bought land. He looked like a man who decided what the earth was allowed to grow. "Sign it," Jae-won said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that didn't need to rise to command attention. Across from him, a younger developer sat trembling, a fountain pen hovering over a contract that would effectively dissolve his family's three-generation construction firm. "Mr. Park, the heritage of the site?" "Heritage is the polite word for decay," Jae-won interrupted, finally turning. His dark eyes were as flat as obsidian. "You are sentimental about a pile of bricks. I am offering you a future of steel. Sign, or by 4 p.m., I will trigger the debt buyback clause, and you will leave this office with nothing but your heritage." The pen scratched the paper. The deal was done. Jae-won didn't offer a handshake. He simply gestured to his chief of staff, Kim, to escort the man out. As the door clicked shut, Jae-won's gaze drifted to the only item on his desk that wasn't a piece of high-end technology, a physical file, thick and weathered, labeled The Atlanta Project, Ebenezer Covenant Reformed. He walked over and flipped it open. Inside was a photograph of a red brick church. It was a sturdy, dignified structure, built with the sweat of the Jim Crow era, sitting stubbornly on a lush 4-acre rise in the heart of a rapidly gentrifying Atlanta district. To the city's historians, it was a landmark. To the neighbors, it was a sanctuary. To Park Jae-won, it was a tumor. 18 months, he muttered to the empty room. He loathed the church, not for its God. Jae-won had no use for deities, but for its defiance. He had already acquired the surrounding 30 acres. He had blueprints for a $200 million new Seoul complex, shimmering glass residential towers, a luxury mall, and a tech hub that would redefine the southern skyline. But right in the center of his masterpiece sat this shack. This architectural rot with its stained glass and its Jesus Saves sign that blinked in a rhythm that irritated his very soul. Kim re-entered the room, checking his watch. "The legal team in Georgia says the Deacon Board is still refusing the final buyout, sir. They've stopped taking our calls." Jae-won's jaw tightened. "Who is the primary obstruction?" "The same woman, sir. Gloria Reeves. She's officially the head of the building committee now. Our local council says she's formidable." Jae-won let out a short, dry laugh. He had broken unions in Busan and outmaneuvered government ministers in Singapore. He was the Goliath of Seoul. The idea of a 62-year-old woman in a church hat standing in the way of a global empire was almost insulting. They have a saying in their country, Kim, every man has his price. And every woman, sir. Jae-won closed the file with a decisive thud. She doesn't have a price because she hasn't seen the buyer yet. She thinks she's dealing with a law firm. She needs to see the man who's going to pave over her past. He walked to the window, the lights of Seoul shimmering like a field of cold diamonds. Clear my schedule for the weekend, Jae-won ordered. Book the Gulf Stream. I want to be in Atlanta by Good Friday. Sir, that's Easter weekend. The board expects you for the quarterly review on Monday. I'll be back by Monday with the signed deed in my hand, Jae-won said, his reflection in the glass looking through him. The resurrection is a myth, Kim, but the demolition? That I can guarantee. The humidity of an Atlanta spring always felt like a heavy silk blanket, but inside the basement of Ebenezer Covenant Reformed, the air was crisp, smelling of floor wax, old paper, and high-octane coffee. Gloria Reeves adjusted her glasses, gold-rimmed and sharp, as she scanned the spreadsheets laid out across a heavy oak table. She wasn't wearing a floral apron or a grandmotherly cardigan. Today, she wore a bespoke cream-colored power suit with a silk scarf tied in a perfect Windsor knot at her throat. Her hair was a silver crown, coiled into a sophisticated French twist. The 2.5-acre northern easement is untouchable under the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, Gloria said, her voice a rich, resonant contralto that had once silenced aggressive prosecutors in federal court. If Park's lawyers try to argue that the parking lot isn't part of the historic footprint, we hit them with the 1972 Boundary Amendment. Pastor, are you listening? Pastor Miller, a man 20 years her junior, looked up from his Bible, blinking. Gloria, the man is offering $40 million. The roof leaks every time it drizzles, and the youth wing needs a congregation with a backbone, Silas, Gloria interrupted, not unkindly, but with the absolute authority of a woman who had spent 30 years as a civil rights attorney. She tapped a rhythmic beat on the table with a manicured fingernail. $40 million is a bribe to vacate our history. That land was bought with the nickels and dimes of domestic workers who weren't allowed to sit at the lunch counters downtown. You don't sell a miracle for a profit. A younger deacon, Marcus, leaned in. But Ms. Gloria, Park Jae-won isn't just some local developer. I looked him up. They call him the Reaper in Seoul. He doesn't lose. He has a legal team that costs more per hour than our entire annual benevolence fund. Gloria finally looked up, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It was the smile of a woman who had stood on the front lines of marches when the hoses were turned on. A woman who had argued before the Supreme Court while men in the back row whispered that she didn't belong there. I've spent 62 years being told what men like Mr. Park are going to do to me, she said softly. I've seen the Reaper in many forms. Sometimes he wears a hood, sometimes he wears a badge, and sometimes he wears a $5,000 Italian suit. But he always makes the same mistake. What's that? Marcus asked. He thinks that because I'm a woman of God, I'm not a woman of the law, Gloria replied. She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. She looked around the basement, the cracked linoleum, the photos of the founding deacons on the wall, the faint scent of Sunday's upcoming lilies. She picked up a heavy blue folder, her war chest, and tucked it under her arm. He's coming here personally. He thinks his presence will intimidate a church lady into folding her hands in prayer and stepping aside. She walked toward the stairs, her heels clicking with military precision against the floor. Let him come! He's looking for a deed. What he's going to find is a wall. She paused at the door, looking back at the nervous men in the room. And tell the choir to practice Victory is Mine for the Easter service, she added, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp wit. I want them to be in full voice when Mr. Park realizes he stepped into the wrong house. The air in the cabin of the Gulfstream G650 was pressurized to a perfect silent stillness, but the atmosphere was vibrating with corporate hostility. Jae-won sat in a cream leather chair, a glass of neat scotch in one hand and a tablet in the other. On the screen, 3 faces stared back at him via satellite link from Seoul. They were the elder council of his conglomerate, men who had ridden his coattails for a decade and were now looking for a reason to cut them off. The Atlanta project has tied up 300 billion won in liquid capital for 18 months, Chairman, the oldest director Min said. His voice was thin and sharp. The delays are no longer an embarrassment. They are a liability. The market is whispering that you've lost your edge. Jae-won swirled his drink, watching the amber liquid catch the light of the setting sun over the Atlantic. The market whispers because it has nothing better to do. The site is the crown jewel of the South. A few more days won't change the ROI. You have until Easter Monday, Min countered. If the deed is not signed and the demolition permits aren't filed by the time the Seoul Stock Exchange opens on Tuesday morning, we will move for a vote of no confidence. We have the proxies, Jae-won. Don't test us. The screen went black. Jae-won didn't move. He didn't fume. He simply set the tablet down and looked out the window at the thick, cotton candy clouds. A vote of no confidence. They were trying to stage a coup over a few hundred square feet of Georgia red clay and a collection of aging pews. Kim! Jae-won called out. His chief of staff appeared instantly from the galley. Yes, sir? The woman, Gloria Reeves. Tell me about her negotiation style again. Kim consulted his notes. She is thorough. She doesn't raise her voice. She drinks Earl Grey tea. She has turned down 7 consecutive offers, each 20% higher than the last. She told our local council that God isn't interested in the exchange rate. Jae-won's lip curled into a smirk. He found it almost charming, the quaint, delusional stubbornness of the religious. To him, Gloria Reeves was a character from a fading storybook, a relic of a world where people believed no actually meant something in the face of how much. She thinks she's protecting a sanctuary, Jae-won said, standing up to stretch his legs. In reality, she's just holding out for a sense of importance. These types always are. They want to feel like they've wrestled with the giant before they take the gold. I'll give her 30 minutes of my time. I'll let her talk about her heritage and her community. I'll even offer to name the new luxury fountain after her late husband. And if she still refuses, sir? Jae-won turned, his eyes cold and predatory. She won't. People like Gloria Reeves have spent their lives in small rooms with small budgets. They've never stood in the path of a hurricane. When I walk into that church office on Friday morning, she's going to realize that her God might be eternal, but her injunctions are not. He finished his scotch in one swallow. She's a grandmother, Kim. She's probably spent the last week baking for a church social. She's expecting a businessman. I'm going to give her a reckoning. As the pilot announced their descent into Hartsfield-Jackson International, Jae-won adjusted his cufflinks. He wasn't thinking about the board's ultimatum anymore. He was thinking about the look on Gloria's face when she finally understood that the Goliath of Seoul didn't come to negotiate. He came to conquer. He would be back in Seoul by Monday, the deed in his pocket, and the rot of Ebenezer Covenant Reformed would be nothing more than a memory and a pile of dust. The air in the church's conference room was thick with the scent of expensive wool and cheap industrial cleaner. Jae-won sat at the head of the table, his presence turning the modest space into a high-stakes arena. Behind him stood a phalanx of 4 lawyers, their briefcases clicked open like bared teeth. Across from him, Gloria Reeves sat alone. She didn't have a legal team. She had a Bible, a pair of reading glasses, and a lukewarm cup of tea. Mr. Park, she said, her voice smooth as river stone, You've traveled a long way to see a building you intend to destroy? Jae-won didn't smile. He signaled to his lead counsel, a man named Henderson, who was known for being a shark in Georgia real estate. Henderson slid a thick vellum envelope across the table. Ms. Reeves, Henderson began, his tone patronizingly warm, Chairman Park is a man of vision. We are authorized to increase our previous offer by an additional $10 million. That brings the total to $50 million. Furthermore, we will fund the construction of a legacy chapel 2 miles west of here. This is a check for a $5 million non-refundable deposit. You can take it today. The lawyers held their breath. In their world, this was the killing blow. Gloria didn't touch the envelope. She didn't even glance at the numbers. Instead, she reached into her blue folder and pulled out 3 stapled documents. She slid them across the table toward Jae-won, not Henderson. I'm not a merchant, Mr. Park, so I don't speak in deposits, Gloria said quietly. I am a steward, and as a steward, I've spent the last 3 weeks doing some light reading. Jae-won frowned, picking up the top document. His eyes scanned the text. His expression remained neutral, but his grip on the paper tightened. This is a preemptive injunction, Jae-won stated, his voice flat. Filed and signed by Judge Higgins 3 weeks ago, Gloria replied. It bars any transfer of title or site preparation until a full audit of the 1922 heritage deed is completed. But keep reading. The second document is the interesting one. Jae-won flipped the page. It was a citation of a specific Georgia State Historic Preservation statute, one that protected any religious structure built on land once used as a post-Civil War freedmen's settlement. The church sits on an African-American burial ground. Mr. Park, Gloria said, leaning forward. The warmth in her eyes had been replaced by a sharp legal brilliance. A small one, beneath the old parsonage. Under Georgia law, you cannot move a single brick without a 5-year archaeological survey. And since I filed the injunction before your final offer expired, your purchase agreement is legally paralyzed. The silence in the room became deafening. Jae-won turned his head slowly toward Henderson. Is this accurate? Henderson was staring at the documents, his face draining of color. He leaned in, whispering frantically to the other lawyers, flipping through his own binders. He looked back at Jae-won, his voice trembling. Sir, she's found a legislative knot. The statute she's citing was amended last year. It's airtight. She's boxed us in. We can't litigate our way out of this for at least 36 months. Maybe longer. Jae-won looked back at Gloria. For the first time in his career, the Goliath of Seoul felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a corporation or a government, but by a woman who looked like she should be teaching Sunday school. He felt the hot sting of humiliation prickling at his neck. His own team, the men he paid thousands an hour, were silent, rendered useless by a grandmother with a sharp mind and a sense of history. You knew I was coming, Jae-won said, his voice a dangerous low. I knew someone was coming, Gloria corrected him. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Men who want to buy the world always arrive eventually. But you should know something about this church, Mr. Park. We don't fold, we endure. She checked her watch, a simple gold piece. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to check on the floral arrangements for the Good Friday service. You're welcome to stay, though. It's hard to get a flight out in this weather, and your injunction isn't going anywhere. Neither are you. She walked out of the room, leaving the most powerful man in Seoul staring at a $50 million check that was suddenly worth no more than the paper it was printed on. The sky over Atlanta had turned a bruised, sickly purple, the kind of heavy atmosphere that heralded a southern deluge. Outside the church windows, the wind began to howl, whipping the ancient oaks until they clawed at the brickwork. Inside the conference room, the silence was a vacuum. Jae-won stood by the window, his jaw set so tight it ached. Behind him, His legal team was a mess of hushed, panicked whispers and frantic tapping on laptop keys. "The airport has grounded all private departures, Chairman," Kim whispered, stepping into the room with his head bowed. "The storm cell is severe, and the local sheriff's office just served a stay of execution on our equipment move-in. We can't even bring the trailers onto the adjacent lot." Jae-won didn't turn around. He was watching the rain begin to lash against the glass and sheets. He was a man who moved at the speed of light, whose life was measured in quarterly growths and global acquisitions. Now he was trapped in a room that smelled of lemon polish and old hymnals, defeated by a woman who hadn't even raised her voice. "Go to the hotel," Jae-won commanded, his voice cold. "The roads are flooded, sir," Kim said tentatively. "The drainage in this district, it's blocked. The limousines are stuck 3 blocks away. We are quite literally stranded." The door to the conference room opened. Gloria Reeves stood there holding a stack of programs. She had traded her suit jacket for a dark cardigan, and she looked at the room full of panicked, high-priced men with a calm that was more infuriating than any insult. "Mr. Henderson, you and your associates should head to the fellowship hall," Gloria said, gesturing down the hall. "The ladies are setting out ham sandwiches and coffee. It looks like the Lord wants you to stay put for a while." The lawyers looked at Jae-won, waiting for a burst of rage that didn't come. Instead, Jae-won turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Gloria's. "You think this is a victory," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed humiliation. "You've delayed the inevitable. You've used a storm and a dusty statute to waste my time. But on Monday, the sun will rise and I will own this ground." Gloria walked toward him, stopping only when she was a few feet away. She didn't flinch at his height or his power. She looked at him with something that felt dangerously like pity. "You've spent 18 months trying to buy this place, Mr. Park. You've studied the blueprints, the acreage, and the zoning laws. But you haven't spent a single minute in the sanctuary." "I have no interest in your myths, Ms. Reeves." "It's Friday," she said softly, ignoring his bite. "In our tradition, we call it good, but it's the day of a funeral. We remember a man who was betrayed for silver, judged by a kangaroo court, and executed by an empire that thought it was too big to fail." She held out a program to him. It was simple, printed on plain white paper. "Good Friday Tenebrae service. You're stranded, your planes are grounded, and your lawyers are currently eating egg salad in my basement," Gloria said, a flicker of wit returning to her eyes. "You came here to buy the house of God, Mr. Park. Since you're not going anywhere, you might as well stay for the funeral." Jae-won looked at the program, then at the woman who had just dismantled his multi-million-dollar strategy with a smile and a filing. The humiliation burned in his chest, a hot, heavy weight. He wanted to scream, to fire his staff, to tear the building down with his bare hands. But the thunder shook the floorboards, a low, tectonic rumble that felt like a rebuke. "The service starts in 20 minutes, Gloria added, turning to leave. "Middle pew is the most comfortable. I'll save you a seat near the back, in case you need to make a quick exit when things get too honest for you." She left the door open. Jae-won looked at his reflection in the dark window. He looked like a king without a kingdom, draped in $5,000 of wool and nowhere to go. With a sharp, frustrated exhale, he snatched the program from the table and walked out into the hallway, following the sound of an organ beginning to groan a low, mournful dirge. The sanctuary of Ebenezer Covenant. Reformed was a cavern of shadows. The only light came from 7 tall, white candles flickering on the altar, their flames dancing in the draft created by the storm outside. Jae-won sat in the very last pew, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He felt like a foreign object lodged in a wound. The air here was heavy with the scent of lilies and damp coats, a stark contrast to the sterile, pressurized scent of his Seoul office. Performance art, he thought. his eyes tracking the elderly ushers in their white gloves, a primitive ritual designed to keep the masses content with their poverty. He checked his watch, 7:14 p.m. In Seoul, the markets were opening. Fortunes were being made. Here, a woman in a choir robe was adjusting a sheet of music as if it were a sacred scroll. He mocked the inefficiency of it all, the slow pace, the creaking wood, the way these people looked at the wooden cross at the front with such desperate, aching hope. Then, the music stopped. Pastor Miller stood behind the pulpit. He didn't open a giant Bible or shout. He simply leaned forward, his hands gripping the wood. "Tonight," the pastor began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath Jaewon's feet. "We talk about the price of a man. We talk about Judas Iscariot." Jaewon felt a flicker of interest. Business. He understood prices. Judas wasn't a monster, Miller continued. He was a pragmatist. He was a man who looked at the Messiah and saw an asset that wasn't performing. He saw a kingdom that wasn't being built fast enough. So, he decided to liquidate. He decided that 30 pieces of silver in the hand were worth more than a soul in the bush. Jaewon stiffened. The word liquidate felt like a slap. He thought he was being smart. Pastor Miller's voice rose, filling the rafters. He thought he was the only one in the room who understood how the world really worked. He thought gold could buy him a future. But when the silver hit the floor of the temple, it didn't sound like money anymore. It sounded like the clanging of his own coffin. The sanctuary went dark as the first candle was extinguished. Jaewon tried to look away, but the darkness pinned him in place. Suddenly, he wasn't seeing the pastor. He was seeing the face of the young developer from Monday, the man who had signed away his family's legacy with a trembling hand. He saw the faces of the tenants he'd evicted in Incheon, the rivals he'd crushed without a second thought. He had always called it efficiency. He had called it progress. The choir began to hum. It was a low, mournful sound that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the marrow. Then, a solo soprano voice pierced the gloom, singing, "Were you there? Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" The second candle went out. Jaewon's heart began to hammer against his ribs. It was a physical sensation he hadn't felt in 40 years, not since he was a boy in a dirt floor shack, terrified of the world. "Sometimes it causes me to tremble," the choir sang, their voices swelling into a wall of sound. "Tremble, tremble." Jaewon's hands, usually so steady, began to shake. He gripped his knees, trying to ground himself in his expensive suit, his status, his billions. But the music was stripping him bare. For the first time, he didn't see himself as the Goliath of Seoul. He saw a man who had spent 40 years collecting silver while his soul starved to death. He saw a man who had built a kingdom of glass on a foundation of broken people. The third candle flickered out. In the near-total darkness, Jaewon felt a hot, stinging moisture behind his eyes. He fought it. He was Park Jae-won. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He bought and sold the world. But as the choir hit a haunting, minor chord, the weight of his own ruthlessness, the sheer, cold vacuum of his life, caved in on him. He wasn't the buyer. He was the one who had been sold. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the back of the pew in front of him. A single, jagged sob escaped his throat, lost in the rising tide of the music. In the back row of a church he had come to destroy, the most powerful man in Korea finally felt the one thing he couldn't afford: the truth. The storm had passed, leaving Atlanta draped in a heavy, humid silence. Holy Saturday was a day of waiting, a day of the in-between. For Park Jae-won, it was a day spent in the basement of Ebenezer Covenant Reformed, surrounded by the smell of dust and the frantic energy of his legal team. There has to be a clerical error in the 1922 filing, Henderson muttered, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot from a night of poring over digitized records. If the land was deeded under a defunct corporation, the historic status is void. Check the basement archives again. Physical copies. Sometimes the scans miss the margins. Jae-won sat at a folding metal table, a paper cup of lukewarm black coffee in his hand. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that soprano voice. Were you there? He watched Kim and two junior associates pull gray archival boxes from a rusted industrial shelf. They were looking for a loophole, a legal knife to twist into the heart of the church's defense. Sir, Kim said, his voice hesitant. He was holding a slender, leather-bound volume. Its spine was cracked. The gold lettering faded to a ghostly impression. This isn't the deed. It's a benevolence ledger, 1970 through 1980. I don't care about their charity work, Kim, Jae-won said, his voice flat. Find the property record. But, sir, the names. Kim walked over, placing the book on the table. It fell open to a page dated October 14th, 1974. The entries were handwritten in a looping, elegant script, the kind taught in schoolrooms before the world became digital. Paid to Widow Sarah Jenkins. Amount $40. Purpose heating oil. Paid to Thomas Miller. Amount $15. Purpose bus fare for a job interview. Jae-won's eyes drifted down the page. Then his heart stopped. Near the bottom of the ledger, the ink was slightly darker, as if the pen had been pressed with great care. Paid to Park Sang-ho. Amount $3,000. Purpose Emergency Medical and Relocation Fund, the Park family. Beneath the entry was a signature in Korean characters, shaky but unmistakable. It was the calligraphy of a man who had been a scholar in his homeland, but a laborer in America. It was his grandfather's hand. Jae-won's fingers brushed the yellowed paper. 1974. The year his father had nearly died of pneumonia in a cramped apartment in downtown Atlanta. The year they were supposed to have been evicted. The year his grandfather had suddenly found the capital to move them to a small grocery store in the suburbs. The store that became a chain, then a distribution center, then the foundation of the Park global empire. My grandfather always told me he worked 3 jobs to save that money, Jae-won whispered, the words catching in his throat. He said he found a private benefactor who believed in the Korean spirit. He looked at the top of the page. The heading read, The Ebenezer Benevolence Fund, from the Lord's pulpit to the neighbor's table. He looked around the basement. This room, this damp, crowded, architectural rot of a basement. This was the benefactor. The $3,000 that had saved his father's life, that had launched his family into the stratosphere of the global elite, hadn't come from a bank or a government grant. It had come from the nickels and dimes of the domestic workers and laborers Gloria had spoken of. It had come from a congregation that had nothing, giving everything to a family that didn't even speak their language. Sir, Henderson asked, oblivious, I think I found a discrepancy in the 1954 zoning. If we push the public utility angle... Shut up, Jae-won said. It wasn't a shout. It was a ghost of a sound. Sir? Jae-won stood up, his chair screeching against the linoleum. He picked up his phone and took a photo of the ledger, specifically the signature of Park Sang-ho. Get out, Jae-won said, looking at his team. Chairman, we are close to a breakthrough. I said get out! Jae-won's voice finally broke, echoing off the concrete walls. All of you, go to the airport. Wait for the plane. I'm staying. He snatched the leather book and walked out of the basement, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't go to his car. He walked out into the center of the church parking lot. the very ground he had planned to tear up and pave over with luxury granite. He sat on the curb in the afternoon sun, staring at the photo on his phone. For 2 hours, the most powerful real estate mogul in Asia sat in the dirt of a South Atlanta church, realizing that his entire life was a debt he could never repay. He hadn't come to buy the church. He had been living on its grace all his life. The red tail lights of the rental SUV cast a bleeding glow onto the cracked asphalt of the church parking lot. Inside the darkened cabin, the air conditioning hummed, a sterile contrast to the heavy, pine-scented Atlanta night. Jae-won stared at the glowing screen of his phone. The photo of the 1974 ledger was still there, the ink of his grandfather's signature looking like a jagged scar across his conscience. With a hand that felt leaden, he scrolled through his contacts until he reached a name he hadn't dialed in 3 years. Minho. The ringing tone was a rhythmic mechanical chirp, echoing the distance between 2 continents and 2 hearts. Then, a click. Father? The voice was wary, sharp with the expectation of an argument. It's 4 a.m. in Seoul. Is the Atlanta deal dead? Jae-won closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the leather headrest. The deal is irrelevant, Minho. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. Irrelevant? You spent 18 months obsessed with that lot. You told me business was the only legacy that didn't rot. What's happened? I found a debt, Jae-won said, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Not a financial one. A blood debt. Do you remember what your great-grandfather told us? About the angel who funded the first store? Of course, the mysterious investor. The foundation stone of Park Global. It wasn't an investor, Minho. It was a collection plate. Jae-won looked out at the dark silhouette of the church, its steeple pointing like a silent finger toward the stars. It was this church, these people. They fed us when we were starving, and I came here with a wrecking ball. Father? Minho's voice softened, the edge of bitterness giving way to a confused, fragile hope. I've spent my life building walls of glass so I wouldn't have to look at the dirt I came from, Jae-won whispered. I thought I was the one who climbed the mountain. I didn't realize I was being carried the whole time. He stayed on the line for an hour, talking to his son, not about stocks or acquisitions, but about the grandfather they both missed. For the first time in his life, Jae-won wasn't a CEO. He was just a grandson, grieving for a history he had almost erased. Across the parking lot, in the second-story window of the parsonage, Gloria Reeves pulled back the lace curtain. The silhouette of the lone car was a dark island in the sea of asphalt. She saw the faint blue glow of a phone screen inside, the only light in the valley. She didn't need to be a mind reader to know what was happening in that car. She had seen men break before. Usually they broke into pieces, but sometimes, by the grace of God, they broke open. She sat in her armchair, her well-worn Bible open on her lap to the book of Ezekiel. She didn't go out to him. She didn't offer a platitude or a lecture. She knew that the most important negotiations don't happen in boardrooms. They happen in the dark, between a man and his maker. Lord, she whispered, her voice a soft hum in the quiet room, you brought him across an ocean to find his way home. Don't let his pride be the thing that keeps him outside the door. Soften the stone, Lord. Turn the lion into a lamb. She watched until the car lights finally flickered off. He's fighting you, Jesus, she murmured with a tired, knowing smile. But I've seen you work, and I know you've never lost a wrestling match yet. She stayed in that window, a silent sentry of prayer, until the first gray light of Easter Sunday began to bleed over the horizon, turning the red bricks of the church into the color of a beating heart. The morning air was no longer heavy. It was electric. The scent of hundreds of lilies, white, waxy, and defiant, filled the sanctuary, battling the smell of old wood and Sunday perfume. The congregation of Ebenezer Covenant Reformed was a sea of vibrant color. Women wore wide-brimmed hats in shades of robin's egg blue, canary yellow, and royal purple. Men straightened silk ties and patted their foreheads with linen handkerchiefs. But as the clock neared 11 a.m., the usual joyful chatter began to die down into a series of sharp, rhythmic whispers. The side door creaked open. Park Jae-won walked in. He had shed the armor of the Western billionaire. Gone was the charcoal gray Italian wool. In its place, he wore a modern interpretation of a hanbok, a long, deep navy tunic made of heavy silk that shimmered like the midnight sea, structured with a high, stiff collar and a subtle silver embroidery of a crane along the cuff. It was the garment of a man who had finally remembered who his ancestors were. The usher, a man named Mr. Isaac who had been handing out programs for 40 years, froze. He looked at the tall, silver-haired Korean man, then at the empty front row usually reserved for the deacons and the elderly. Jae-won didn't wait for an invitation. He walked down the center aisle. Every head turned. The rhythmic fanning of church programs stopped. The tension was so thick it felt like a physical weight. To many in these pews, this man was the face of the monster trying to swallow their history. He was the Reaper. He reached the very first row, directly beneath the towering wooden cross, and sat down. He didn't look back. He didn't check his phone. He placed his hands on his knees and stared at the empty pulpit. "Is he here to serve us the papers?" a woman whispered 3 rows back, her voice carrying in the sudden vacuum of sound. "Maybe he's here to buy the pews out from under us while we pray," her husband muttered. In the wings of the pulpit, Gloria Reeves watched through the crack of the vestry door. She saw the set of his shoulders, no longer rigid with the arrogance of a predator, but heavy with the gravity of a pilgrim. She saw the way he looked at the altar, not as an appraiser, but as a man looking at a life raft. "Gloria," Pastor Miller whispered behind her, adjusting his gold stole. "He's in the front row. My sermon is about the stone being rolled away, but I feel like I'm walking into a lion's den." Gloria turned, her eyes bright with a fierce, quiet joy. She straightened the pastor's collar with a firm hand. "That's not a lion in the front row, Pastor," she said, her voice steady. "That's a man who has spent 3 days in the belly of a whale. Don't worry about the sermon. The Holy Spirit already started the service in the parking lot last night." The organist struck the first thunderous chord of "Christ the Lord is risen today." The congregation stood, 1,000 voices rising in a wall of sound that shook the very foundation of the building. Jae-won stood with them. He didn't know the words. He couldn't join the harmony. But as the music swelled, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in his 60 years, Park Jae-won didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt like a guest who had finally arrived at the right house. The final strains of Victory in Jesus ebbed away, leaving the sanctuary in a state of breathless, expectant silence. Pastor Miller moved toward the pulpit to begin the benediction, but he paused. Park Jae-won had stood up. A ripple of anxiety moved through the pews. Deacons shifted their weight. A few younger men in the back moved toward the aisles. Eyes narrowed. In a world of corporate takeovers, a CEO standing uninvited usually meant the gavel was about to fall. Jae-won didn't look at the congregation. He turned toward the pulpit, his face pale against the navy silk of his hanbok. He held a manila envelope in his hands, the same one that had contained the death warrant of the church's deed. "Pastor," Jae-won's voice broke the silence. It wasn't the voice of the Goliath of Seoul. It was thin, trembling with a frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight to the heart. "I do not belong at this altar. I came here to take. I came here to erase." He walked up the 3 shallow steps to the platform. He didn't stop at the lectern. He stopped in front of the communion table. My family, the Park family, We have been living on the interest of a debt we never acknowledged, he said, turning now to face the people. He pulled the deed from the envelope and held it up. I came to buy this land for $40 million. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was the master of this transaction. He looked down at the paper, his eyes filling with tears that he no longer tried to hide. But yesterday I found a name in your ledger. Park Sang-ho, my grandfather. Jaewon's voice hitched, a raw, jagged sound. In 1974, when he had nothing, this church gave him $3,000. You didn't ask for a credit score. You didn't ask for collateral. You gave him the life of my father and the future of my sons. He gripped the deed with both hands and, with a slow, deliberate motion, laid it flat on the communion table. The place of the broken bread. I cannot buy what was already paid for with your sacrifice, he whispered. I return this deed to you. It is yours. It has always been God's. Then the man who had never bowed to a board of directors or a government minister did something that made the entire room gasp. He didn't just sit down. Park Jae-won sank to his knees on the carpeted floor of the altar. I have endowed a $5 million perpetual fund in my grandfather's name to restore this sanctuary, he choked out, his head bowed, not to buy your favor, but to begin to say, thank you. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of weeping, not just from Jae-won, but from the pews. Gloria Reeves stepped forward from her seat behind the pulpit. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a mother watching a prodigal stumble over the threshold. She walked to Jae-won, placed a hand on his trembling shoulder, and then looked out at her congregation. Church, Gloria said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that felt like bells on a Sunday morning. For 18 months, I have stood at the door of this temple like a guard. I prayed every night for the strength to defeat an enemy. I asked God to break the hand of the man who wanted to take our home. She looked down at the silver hair of the man kneeling at her feet. But God is better at answering prayers than I am at praying them, she said, a small, watery smile touching her lips. I prayed for an enemy to be defeated, and God sent us a brother to be loved. She reached down, her fingers firm and warm, and helped Jae-won to his feet. The congregation rose as one, a spontaneous roar of Amen and Hallelujah, shaking the rafters. After the service, as the crowd spilled out into the bright, blooming Georgia afternoon, Jae-won stood by the heavy oak doors. He looked exhausted, stripped of his armor, but for the first time, his eyes were clear. Gloria approached him, her Bible tucked under her arm. You look like you've gone 12 rounds with an angel, Mr. Park. Jae-won managed a weak, genuine smile. He looked at the church, then at the woman who had stood her ground until he finally found his. Ms. Reeves. Gloria, he began, pausing to find the right words. My plane is waiting at the airport. My board is waiting in Seoul. But I don't want to go yet. I realize I have everything in the world, and I know absolutely nothing about how to live. He looked at her, his expression vulnerable, devoid of any corporate strategy. Would you consider taking a seeker to lunch? Not the chairman. Just a man who needs to know more about the God who keeps such good ledgers. Gloria looked at him for a long beat, then reached out and tucked her arm into his. Well, Mr. Park, she said, leading him toward her car, the first lesson is that in this house, we don't call it lunch. We call it Sunday dinner. And you're going to need to take off that fancy jacket if you're going to help me snap the green beans. They walked across the parking lot together, the CEO and the deaconess, while the Easter sun shone down on a church that remained exactly where it was meant to be. The interior of Gloria's kitchen was a far cry from the minimalist, stainless steel voids of Seoul's high-rise penthouses. Here, the air was a thick, fragrant humidity of slow simmering ham hocks, vinegar, and sweetness. Sunlight poured through yellow gingham curtains, illuminating a lifetime of porcelain roosters and framed Bible verses. Jae-won stood in the center of the linoleum floor, still wearing his silk hanbok trousers, though he had draped his tunic over a chair. He looked like a displaced prince. "Mr. Park, if you stand there any longer, you're going to grow roots," Gloria said, tying a sturdy denim apron over her Sunday best. She pointed to a mountain of leafy greens piled high on the butcher block island. "Wash those. Twice. Cold water only." Jae-won looked at the greens as if they were a complex legal merger. "These are the collards?" "Those are the lifeblood of the South, honey. Now, scrub." The Goliath of Seoul, a man who had once negotiated a semiconductor deal with the president of France, plunged his hands into the sink. He worked with a silent, intense precision, his brow furrowed. "You're overthinking the leaves, Jae-won," Gloria chuckled, moving past him to retrieve a heavy, black circular object from the stove. It looked like a piece of ancient industrial equipment. "What is that?" he asked, drying his hands. "This," she said with a note of reverence, "is my grandmother's cast iron skillet. It's been seasoned for 80 years. It's seen 3 wars, 2 movements, and more cornbread than you can count." She set it down and handed him a small bowl of salt and a jar of bacon drippings. "The board of directors isn't here to give you instructions. This is about feel. Rub the oil in. Make sure you hit the edges. If you treat the iron right, it'll never let the bread stick." Jae-won took the heavy pan. It was deceptively weighted, holding the heat of the kitchen. As he rubbed the oil into the porous black metal, he felt a strange grounding rhythm. In Seoul, everything was replaceable. If a window cracked, you swapped the glass. If a contract failed, you sued. But this was about preservation. "In my country," he said softly, his hands dark with oil, "we have ongi, earthenware crocks for kimchi. They breathe, they age with the family." Gloria smiled, leaning against the counter with a steaming mug of Earl Grey. "See? You aren't as far from home as you thought. Heritage isn't just about what you keep in a museum, Mr. Park. It's about what you use to feed your people." The culture shock continued when the doorbell rang. Within 20 minutes, the small kitchen was invaded by 3 more church mothers: Sister Beatrice, Mother Hayes, and Evelyn. They didn't care about his net worth. They didn't care about his Gulf Stream. "Oh, look at him," Mother Hayes chirped, patting Jae-won's arm with a hand that felt like warm parchment. "He's got a good reach. Brother Park, reach up there and get that big stock pot off the top shelf for me, would you?" Jae-won obeyed instantly. He spent the next hour being Brother Parked. He was told his chopping was too slow. He was told he put too much salt in the peas. He was teased about his fancy silk pants until he was actually laughing, a genuine, deep-chested sound that startled even him. By the time they sat down at the crowded dining room table, Jae-won felt a peculiar sensation in his chest. It wasn't the tightness of stress or the burn of ambition. It was a fullness. He watched Gloria lead the grace, her hand resting naturally near his on the tablecloth. He looked at the bowl of collard greens he had washed, sitting in the center of the table like a trophy. "Is it to your liking, Brother Park?" Beatrice asked, winking. Jae-won took a bite. It was bitter, salty, smoky, and bright all at once. It tasted like survival. It tasted like the ledger from a 1974. "It is," Jae-won said, looking directly at Gloria. "It tastes like mercy." Gloria met his gaze, her eyes softening. For the first time in 40 years, the billionaire didn't feel the need to check his watch. The world could wait. The greens were seasoned, the skillet was hot, and for the first time, Park Jae-won was exactly where he belonged. 14 days later. The fluorescent hum of the church's small library felt like a stark contrast to the warm mahogany of Seoul's boardrooms. Jae-won sat hunched over his laptop, the blue light reflecting off a face that had aged 10 years in 3 days. The screen was a battlefield. A leaked memo from the Elder Council was scrolling across the Korea Economic Daily. Chairman Park Jae-won relinquishes Atlanta project. Board cites potential emotional instability and breach of fiduciary duty. "They've frozen my personal accounts," Jae-won said, his voice a hollow rasp. He didn't look up as Gloria entered, carrying a tray of ginger tea. "They are moving for an emergency injunction in the Seoul Central District Court to strip my voting proxies. By tomorrow morning, I will be a billionaire with no access to a single one and a chairman with no company." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with the shame of a man who had built a fortress only to be locked out of the gate. "I returned your deed, Gloria, and in doing so, I destroyed the only thing I had left." Gloria didn't offer a platitude. She set the tea down with a firm clack and pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a pair of sharp, black-rimmed reading glasses, her war glasses. "Is that what you think?" she asked, her voice dropping into that low courtroom register that commanded the air. "That your life is a balance sheet? That if the numbers aren't in the black, the man doesn't exist?" "In Seoul, yes," Jae-won replied. "Power is the only currency." "Well, you aren't in Seoul. You're in the jurisdiction of a woman who spent 30 years defending people the world tried to erase." She reached across the table and pulled his laptop toward her, squinting at the Korean to English translation of the corporate bylaws. "The board is citing emotional instability because you showed mercy?" Gloria let out a short, dry laugh. "That's not a medical diagnosis, Jae-won. That's a legal reach, and they've made a tactical error." Jae-won frowned. "What error? They have the bylaws." "They have the bylaws of a corporation," Gloria said, her eyes flashing with the fire of a seasoned litigator. "But they filed the emergency motion based on the failure of the Atlanta project. Since the project is physically located on Georgia soil and the breach occurred in my backyard, the conflict of laws falls under international arbitration. Specifically, the Georgia-Korea Trade Treaty of 2014. She tapped a specific clause on the screen. "I helped draft the amicus brief for that treaty 10 years ago. If we file a counter-injunction here, in Atlanta, claiming corporate harassment and character defamation, we tie up their voting proxies in a jurisdictional knot that will take them 5 years to untangle." Jae-won stared at her. He had hired the best firms in the world, men who charged $10,000 a day, and none of them had even mentioned the treaty. "You're going to represent me?" he whispered. "I'm going to do more than that," Gloria said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "I'm going to show those men in Seoul that you don't pick a fight with a child of this church and expect to walk away with your pockets full." She walked to the landline on the wall and dialed a number from memory. "Judge Higgins." "Yes, it's Gloria Reeves. I'm sorry to bother you on a Monday morning, Arthur, but I have a billionaire in my library who's being bullied by some men who don't understand how we do things in the South. I need an emergency hearing at 2 p.m. and tell the clerk to bring the heavy stamps. We're filing for a stay of corporate action." She hung up and looked at Jae-won. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of something other than grief. "You're a dangerous woman, Gloria Reeves," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm a deaconess, Jae-won," she corrected him, picking up her briefcase, "which means I know how to handle the bread and I know how to handle the wine. But I also know how to handle the wolves." She tilted her head toward the door. "Now get your coat. We have a mountain to move, and I'm not losing my favorite new dishwasher to a bunch of suits in Seoul." The late April sun was a gentle gold, filtering through the wisteria that draped over Gloria's back porch like a heavy, fragrant curtain. In the distance, the hum of Atlanta traffic felt like a fading memory, eclipsed by the rhythmic snip-snip of garden shears. Jaewon sat on a low wooden bench, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his hands stained with the dark, damp earth of Georgia. He was repotting hydrangeas, a task Gloria had assigned him with the same casual authority she used to command a courtroom. "You're squeezing the roots, Jaewon," Gloria said, not looking up from her rose bushes. "They need room to breathe if they're going to survive the transplant." Jaewon loosened his grip on the root ball. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed away empires and crushed competitors, now caked in dirt. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the three-way conference call scheduled with his Seoul legal team in an hour. He wasn't thinking about the stock price of Park Global, which had stabilized but remained under a cloud of litigation. He was thinking about the silence. "I spent 40 years thinking that if I stopped moving, I would disappear," Jaewon said softly. He set the plant down and looked at the garden, a chaotic, beautiful tapestry of life that didn't require a board of directors to bloom. "I thought if I didn't own the land would swallow me. I thought that buying was the only way to belong." Gloria wiped her brow with the back of a gloved hand and walked over, sitting on the bench beside him. "You were trying to settle a debt, weren't you? Not just to your grandfather, but to the world." Jaewon looked at her, surprised by the surgical precision of her insight. "My grandfather arrived here with nothing. He died with very little. I felt that if I didn't become the biggest, the strongest, the richest, then his struggle was a waste. I thought I had to buy back every ounce of dignity we lost in the dirt." He leaned back, looking up at the sky. "It wasn't an acquisition strategy, Gloria. It was a defense mechanism. I was trying to buy enough power so that no one could ever make us feel small again." "And how does it feel?" she asked, "being the biggest man in the room?" "It feels like a cage," he admitted, the honesty of the statement vibrating in the air between them. "But here, in this garden, I don't have to be the chairman. I don't even have to be a success. I'm just a man who is bad at repotting flowers." Gloria laughed, a warm, musical sound that made the tension in his shoulders finally dissolve. "You aren't that bad, Brother Park. You just have to learn that you can't force things to grow. You have to cultivate the environment, and then you have to wait on the Lord to do the rest." Jaewon looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the strength in the lines around her eyes, the peace in her hands. He realized that all the glass towers in Seoul couldn't buy the serenity she carried in a simple denim apron. "The board offered a settlement this morning," he said, almost as an afterthought. "They'll let me keep my personal assets and a seat on the council if I resign as chairman and drop the counter injunction." Gloria stilled. "And?" "And I realized I don't want the chair," Jaewon said, his voice steady and filled with a new quiet power. "I don't care about the company anymore. I care about the peace I feel when I'm sitting on this porch. I care about the way the light hits these bricks at sunset." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. For a moment, the billionaire and the deaconess sat in a silence that was no longer a negotiation, but a communion. "I came to buy your church, Gloria," he whispered, "but I think I'd rather just be a member of the congregation." Gloria didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "The lawyer and the mogul, the seeker and the guide. Well," she said, her voice thick with a soft southern grace, "we've been needing a new tenor in the choir, but I'm warning you, Jaewon, the rehearsals are on Tuesday nights, and I don't accept executive meetings as an excuse for being late." Jaewon smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He didn't need to buy the world anymore. He had finally found a piece of earth where he could grow. 1 year later. The Atlanta sun was different this year. It didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a benediction. Park Jae-won stepped out of his black sedan, no longer a sleek, armored limousine, but a practical, high-end SUV suited for the hilly streets of the historic district. He was no longer the Goliath of Seoul. The headlines in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution now called him a local visionary, the man who had moved his global tech headquarters to a refurbished mid-century warehouse just 5 blocks from Ebenezer Covenant Reformed. He adjusted the lapel of his suit, light gray silk, a nod to the brightness of the morning, and walked toward the parsonage. The door opened before he could knock. Gloria Reeves stood there, a vision in a suit the color of spring hydrangeas. Her silver strand hair caught the light, and her eyes, once as sharp as legal briefs, were now filled with a settled, radiant warmth. "You're early, Jaewon," she teased, checking her watch. "The choir hasn't even finished their warm-ups." "I've learned that in this city, if you aren't early to Easter Sunday, you're sitting in the folding chairs in the basement," Jaewon replied, offering his arm. As they walked toward the church, they paused at the edge of the adjacent lot, the very land that had once been the bone of their contention. It was no longer a jagged scar of red clay and broken dreams. Instead, a new foundation had been poured. Steel beams reached toward the sky like prayers, the skeleton of the Park Reeves Community Center. "The library wing should be finished by June," Jaewon said, looking at the construction site. He didn't see square footage or ROI. He saw a place where immigrant families would learn English, where local children would have a safe place to study, and where the $3,000 benevolence of 1974 would be multiplied 10,000 times over. "It's a good foundation," Gloria said softly, leaning her weight slightly against his arm. "Solid rock." They entered the sanctuary together. The atmosphere was a jubilant roar of organ music and the scent of 1,000 lilies. The congregation didn't fall silent this time. Instead, a chorus of "Morning, Brother Park," and "Looking Sharp, Miss Gloria," followed them down the aisle. Jaewon led her to the very back row, the same pew where, 1 year ago, he had sat in the dark, mocking the faith of a people he didn't understand. The same wood where he had leaned his forehead and wept for a soul he thought he had lost. They sat down as the choir began the processional. The music was thunderous, a celebration of life over death, of grace over greed. Jaewon looked at the pulpit, then at the stained glass, and finally at the woman beside him. He realized that for 60 years, he had been a man who tried to own the world, only to find that the world was too heavy to carry. Now he owned less, but he possessed everything. As the congregation stood to sing the first hymn, Jaewon didn't reach for a hymnal. He reached for Gloria's hand, their fingers interlaced, his, weathered by a year of gardening and building, hers, steady and wise. It wasn't a corporate handshake or a legal sealing of a deed. It was a quiet, thumb-over-knuckle promise. In the back row of the church he had once come to destroy, Park Jae-won finally closed his eyes and sang. He didn't need to buy the ground beneath his feet anymore. He was finally standing on it. Gloria looked at the man beside her, then lifted her eyes to the cross. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips as she mouthed one silent word to heaven. Thank you. Because she had only prayed for one thing. She had asked God to save the church, and he did. But the God who answers prayer is never limited by the size of the request. He did not only protect the sanctuary. He did not only preserve the land. He did not only stop the hand of the man who came to take. He transformed him. And somewhere between the lawsuit and the ledger, between the altar and the garden, between the tears and the grace, God gave Gloria something she never expected and never even dared to pray for. Love. Not the kind built on flattery. Not the kind bought with power. But the kind only God can write out of wreckage. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. Genesis 50, verse 20. What began as a battle over land became a testimony of mercy. What was meant for erasure became restoration. What pride tried to own, grace redeemed. What the enemy intended for destruction, God turned into healing, legacy, and love. And in the end, the God who kept the record also kept the promise. Because when God writes the ending, even what came to destroy you can become part of the testimony. The end. If this story touched your heart, go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and stay with me for more Christ-centered love stories filled with healing, hope, and the kind of love only God can write. And if you don't want to miss the next story, turn on your notifications so you'll be here when the next chapter begins. Until next time, keep believing in the grace of God that still defies all odds.